Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. This week's episode is incredibly exciting for me because we had the chance to spend 2 hours with one of the world's most interesting artists, film directors, writers, and of course humorists in the last century, Woody Allen. We were extremely fortunate that Woody Allen agreed to sit with us for a long time to discuss his views on the world, his films, and his thoughts about things from philosophy to science. I realize that for some people, this conversation itself will be controversial. The very fact that we're airing a conversation with Woody Allen. For those people, I would say I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Ricky Gervais earlier at the beginning of our podcast, where he said that people that get angry that conversations happen that they don't want to hear are like people who go downtown and see a sign saying guitar lessons for sale outside a door and say, I don't need any damn guitar lessons. Well, if you don't want a guitar lesson, don't go in. If this podcast for any reason upsets you, don't listen to it. But if you do listen to it, I think you'll be fascinated. And I am particularly thankful that Woody Allen trusted me and our crew to come in earlier this year before the pandemic and have a long conversation in his studio in New York City. And I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did when we had the conversation. With no further ado, Woody Allen. Well, Woody, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you this way.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Yeah, well, we'll see how you feel about that after this is over. There's so many things to want to talk to you about, but what I want to be, since this is kind of an origins podcast, I wanted to start with your origins. You didn't like school.
Did not, no.
Yeah, and I read that you were ejected early. Is that really true? Were you kicked out?
Yes, and now I want to be fair. School didn't like me. Equals enthusiasm.
Sure.
You know, it's not that I was a wonderful student and I had disdain for school. We didn't like each other.
Okay.
I went to a public school and then high school. Didn't like public school, didn't like high school. And then to keep my parents from jumping off the roof, I went to college for a very short time. In my freshman year, I took just a drop-dead easy course. I was a motion picture production major.
Oh, really?
And I only took it, not that I was interested in making movies at that point in my life. I only took it because I figured the curriculum, you go to the movies. That's what you do. You go and you talk about them. So I like going to the movies, and I figured it was a goof-off course, and I'd be able to, you know, I wasn't serious. I had no thoughts in those days of being a movie director at all.
Wow.
I just wanted to avoid schoolwork. Now, let me tell you how terrible a student I was.
Okay.
In high school, Midwood High School, I had 2 years of Spanish. 2 years of Spanish.
Okay.
When I went to NYU, I conned them into letting me take Spanish freshman as though I had never had any Spanish at all.
Okay.
And I failed it.
And you
Now, I was sitting in a classroom with, 20 other kids, whatever, and they had no Spanish at all. I had 2 years of Spanish, but I was the one that failed.
But you made it through those 2
I was
years.
not a good student. Also, at that stage of my life, I was trying to learn to play the drums because I was very interested in jazz music. And there would be certain exercises with the foot pedal that you had to practice.
Yeah, sure.
So I would sit in class and the teacher would be lecturing about Beowulf or something.
Yeah.
And I'd be doing paradiddles and things with my feet. And I was kind of 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, so I wasn't paying attention. I learned nothing. In addition to that, I lived in Brooklyn, and NYU, where I went, was on 8th Street. You got off at 8th Street on the train. I'd take the train to 8th Street. The doors would open, and I'd sit there for a minute, and I'd think, do I want to go? Do I not want to? Should I go today? Shouldn't I? And I'd tergiversate for just enough time for the doors to close. And then I'd go up to Broadway on 42nd Street and hang out in the Automat or at the Paramount. And so between playing hooky and my poor scholastic aptitude and their hostility toward me and my indifference toward them, the atmosphere was not conducive towards being educated. Sure. They came to that conclusion before I did.
Before you did, they beat you to it. Okay.
They came to it on their own, and they got me into a room with a conclave of deans. Now, a conclave of deans
I think
is
that's
not
the literal
like
term.
an exaltation of Locke. I mean, it's like it's a group of like 4 drips that sit around a table, and they're telling you in no uncertain terms why you're out. And I had no real argument with them because what could I say? My marks were poor. I didn't attend a lot. When I did attend, I was practicing my foot pedal on the drums. So, they threw me out. And as well they should have.
Did your drumming get better as a result of the classes?
No, I gave up the drums after a while.
Yeah, but you were interested in music then. You were always interested in music, though. You were always
from teenage on, yes. I was always interested in playing music.
So your parents wanted you to go to college. Like my Jewish parents, my mother wanted me to be a doctor. I don't know what. Did your mother, father have any? Did they want you to be?
Yeah, all the kids in the neighborhood that I went to school with were becoming doctors and lawyers and accountants and architects and professors in school. I mean, all had noble ambitions. I didn't. I had sleazy underworld ambitions. I wanted to be a gambler, a car cheat, a con man, anything so I would not have to work, punch a time clock or sit in an office, or I would have been, if I didn't have the ability to write comedy, which is pure luck, it has nothing to do with any achievement of mine or work of mine. It's pure luck. It's like hitting the mega ball or something. I would be probably doing some menial kind of job. I would be delivering for the florist or messenger service or something, because I wouldn't want a job in an office. I wouldn't want to be sitting behind a desk all day. And I don't want to say to people, you'll get a lot of good wear out of this shoe, I just didn't want to do that, or open wide.
Yeah. But I think
I didn't want any of those jobs. So I would have probably done a job that let me be out in the street. And there's very few jobs for a totally unskilled, uneducated, irresponsible person. And I would have been, I guess a messenger or something.
Well, to some extent, that's why I became an academic, too. It's kind of a non-working job.
Non-working, yeah. I've never worked a day in my life. But it's pure luck. It's just
we'll see.
A blessing.
There's a lot of luck. I think there's a lot of effort. But I wanted to know why. Because I'm heading towards the fact that you are incredibly cultured.
Can't find the word. I'm incredibly something, but the word doesn't quite exist.
Exactly. It doesn't quite exist.
I'm incredibly what?
But cultured, but knowledgeable, erudite, literature, music, philosophy, art. In terms of ideas, you're fascinated with ideas, but somehow you got turned off school. Now, I know that I've been reading, and it seemed to me part of the reason may be you had miserable teachers.
I had miserable teachers, yes. But I was also miserable. I don't mean to, blame it all on them. They were terrible. And the education system is not good. And the education system, certainly when I grew up, I don't know if it's changed, but the burden of education was all on the student. I'm just saying I had no interest. I was not a reader as a kid.
Yeah.
I only read comic books. That was it. Just comic books. And I mean, to I would say 16 years old, maybe 17.
You just read what comic books, by the way?
I read all the standard comic books, Superman, Captain Marvel, Batman, and the Green Lantern, all that stuff. And I read with great pleasure Walt Disney and Little Lulu and, the Mighty Mouse. I just loved it all. And you see, when you see a 15-year-old kid or a 16-year-old kid, and he's eating lunch, and his comic book is open to, Woody Woodpecker or something. You think, gee, what is it with this kid? So I was completely uneducated, and unlike my sister, who loved always to read, her idea of heaven is to, get a couple of books and just lay down and read forever. I had no interest in reading at all. It never interested me as a kid. I didn't like it. Time spent other ways was my thing. And I only got educated, not for any noble or ambitious reason. I only did because when I hit about 17 years old or 18 years old, I was attracted to the girls in school.
Uh-huh.
And the girls that I liked, for whatever strange reason I don't know, were the kind of non-commercial bohemian girls that had no lipstick and very little makeup and black tights and black turtlenecks and silver earrings, and they were all interested in art and culture and literature and classical music and architecture and and so in order to keep up my end of the conversation, I had to learn. So
was the girls.
I learned, but if it wasn't for them, if I liked a different type of girl, for instance, who was not interested in that, if her interest lay elsewhere, I would never have learned. But the ones I liked, for whatever reason, there were all those ones that you used to see in the Jules Feiffer cartoons, or the ones that liked to hear the guitar players doing folk music, and they were socialists and they were communists. And
I see a lot of them in your movies. I see those in the early movies, especially. Yeah,
those are the ones. And so, if they would, at first when I started going out with them, they would talk to me, and I was, I had nothing to say back to them. I never read anything they read. I didn't know who Andre Segovia was. I didn't. And gradually, to keep, to be able to get a second date, or even a first one at times, I had to start reading. And so I did read, and some of it I liked and some I didn't. But the problem with being self-educated is that there are huge gaps in your education. So there's some subjects I know pretty well and can talk about. Yeah. And there are other things you think, my God, you mean you've never read any Charles Dickens or something?
Moby Dick.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, well, although, it seems to me that when I look at at least the references in your writing and the movies, it's at least in terms of literature, it seems to me to be remarkably broad. You wrote once that you were you said you were not a habitual reader, but you said it's a chore to read and you don't read for pleasure. You read because it was important to read. Now I know why it was important to read. I never got it from what I read from you. Now I know what. Yeah. But surely it isn't that way now. I mean, when I read what you write or say in interviews, you talk with total pleasure about Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Sartre, Camus, poets, Yeats, Dickinson, Eliot, Rilke. It seems to me that there's a love ultimately of those people. So was there a switch that was turned, or do you still not read for pleasure?
I read very rarely for pleasure. I don't read much for pleasure. There are very few books in my life where the burden of entertainment was completely on the author. I'm talking about fiction now.
Sure.
I can read some poetry because many of the poems are short and do not require a lot of extended concentration. Yeah. Novels, it's not my pleasure of first choice. Yeah. I'd always rather see a movie, see a show in the theater, listen to music, watch a ball game, And I read a certain amount of nonfiction, again, just to keep up in a conversation. But it was just never a great pleasure for me.
Well,
I got off to a bad start, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's the bad start, I think, is the key point. I think, I mean, I keep blaming your early teachers. I think I love a description you wrote once about teachers. You said, talk, talk, talk. But when you see them, they're mean looking, sorry, sad, and bitter. You know what their lives were like. And you said you imbibed from school Socratically rather than intellectually just by looking at your teachers and learning how miserable their lives were.
Yes, and it's also the stuff they gave you to read. The stuff they gave you in school was no fun. It was, first of all, antiseptic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, do you really want to read Gift of the Magi?
Yeah.
You know, you're a kid. You want to read about, when I was a kid, I wanted to read about guns and gangsters and excitement and war stories and intrigue and spies. And I don't want to read about, you know, her combs and his watch fob and, you know, and everything they picked out for you had that kind of bland, antiseptic, don't, you know, offend anybody. God, these kids are so. And it was the same with music. When you went into your music periods or auditorium periods, there was so much beautiful music out there, so much Cole Porter, so much George Gershwin and Jerome Kern that was pleasurable to listen to, and they could have turned you on to music so it was a true pleasure. They didn't. You would go in there and you'd sing Abide With Me or you know, Recessional or, you know, I mean, stuff that, you know, amelodic, antiseptic or solemn stuff that was joyless to kids. And so, you know, I didn't get educated very much because I didn't have a background
or the right kind of encouragement apparently at home or at school. But now, two things though. If your parents didn't listen to music, where did you get your love of music? Was it again? I mean, was it in some sense rebelling against your parents, your friends, your peers, your peer group because music was cool?
I listened to pop music. On the radio. The radio was a big deal, and it was a big deal. You know, you get up in the morning, radio would go right on because it wouldn't interfere with your, you know, your matutinal ablutions. You could just do your thing, and it was fine. So, you know, the radio was on, and I'd be getting dressed and showering, and I showered first, then I got dressed, and then, you know, breakfast and the music. Yeah, the music in those days, you know, talking about many years ago now, was, you know, Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw and Billie Holiday and Peggy Lee, and it was great music, and it was Gershwin and Kern and Irving Berlin and Rodgers and Hart, and so that gets baked into you. Yeah, sure. And so you know, you like it.
And it obviously influenced your taste because when I think about your music taste, there, or at least in terms of the music you use for the movies, it's very broad. It's not just jazz, of course, which appears in a lot of movies, but it's Stravinsky, it's Prokofiev, it's the classics as well. Which
I love classical music too.
Again, that came later, I assume.
That came later, yeah. That was the later thing. You know, at first, we never heard any classical music. I grew up on Harry James and...
Yeah, me too.
The swing musicians. And when I got older, and actually I married young, and my wife came home from school and said, "You got to hear this." She had the Brandenburg Concerto.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And she said we took this in school, and she played them for me, and they were good. I liked them, and so she got me into listening to classical music, and I did it more and more, and I you know, and this past summer, if you can believe it, me, who was a stickball aficionado and champion in the Brooklyn streets, was at La Scala directing a Puccini opera.
Really?
Yeah. So I have developed, in spite of myself, in spite of all my you know, obstacles and reluctance and laziness and bad habits.
It gives hope. You see, it gives hope.
It's hope, yeah. That's
hope for everyone.
You know, I mean, I grew up on none of this. Did not grow up on classical music or literature or anything. I grew up playing stickball, playing punchball, playing stoop ball, playing baseball, schoolyard basketball. and I wound up making a living in the arts.
Yeah, did you have any good teachers, by the way?
Yes, in there were a couple of good teachers.
Well, I have to say, you had a biology teacher that I liked, at least, namely Jessie Kiosian, Mrs. Kiosian, who was in Oedipus Rex.
She's been in a couple of films.
She's a cute little biology teacher.
She was a tiny, tiny little teacher at Midwood High School, and I think I was in her class. But I know she was a bio teacher there, and I think I was in her class. Years later, I was looking for interesting types for small parts. And Juliet Taylor, my casting director, said, I met this wonderful woman who says she knows you, and she's a great type. And then she said her name, and I said, well, yes, I do remember her from Midwood. I can't recall if I was in her class or not. And then she came in, and I used her, and she was wonderful. She was a tiny little thing, and she loved culture in general.
Yeah, did
she
you find
went
that out
to
afterwards?
everything.
You surely didn't find that when you were a student. I mean,
no, when a student, I fled the class always.
But she loved culture.
But when I saw her, I remember seeing her once when I went with my then wife to a little tiny private classical piano recital upstairs in a walk-up in the East Village. Some guy was playing some sonatas, and Jessie Kiosian was there. And I said, hey, she was my biology. And then years later, she showed up in casting and was very good.
Yeah, no, I thought the fact that she had the chutzpah to show up for casting, she must have been at least I would have thought she would be a fun teacher. Well, I want to switch a little bit. So you didn't find out what you were interested in school, really, although it is interesting to me, given what you've done since, that the teachers you found interesting were English teachers, both in high school and in university.
Yes. Yeah. Now, I have to just interrupt you for a second. When I first went to college at NYU and had the English teacher, he was a guy, and we had to hand in our first essays. And I handed in my essay, and he failed me on it and sent me back the paper and said, son, you need a lesson in rudimentary manners. You are a callow adolescent and not a diamond in the rough.
Wow.
And now I was, at that time, trying to write funny.
Yeah.
And I had some talent because while I was in that class, I was being paid. I was working as a comedy writer. So I did have some talent as a writer, but instead of encouraging me or saying, look, this may not have hit the mark, but if you want to write comedy, I would suggest you read S.J. Perelman or Robert Benchley or something. The teachers never stimulated you. There was never any, they didn't know how to.
That's so sad.
To make the most of it. Now, I didn't care. I thought the guy was a screwball, and I couldn't care less. But
if you think if he'd been different, it would have made a difference to you at that time, or you already turned it off?
I think if he had said, "I want to speak to you after school," and it wasn't that dressing down.
Yeah.
If you want to speak to me and say, "Look, if you want to write comedy, I can," I think you struck out here, but I try reading these things and try again and see. After you read these, see if you think these are funny, and let's talk about it.
Sure.
But there was never any, if you didn't do it, you failed.
That's just. What about science? Because the reason I'm asking is, it seems to me that you have at some level a scientific sensibility, which is really asking questions about the universe. And in fact, I was struck early on, obviously because of my own interest, before I knew you, there's wonderful lines about the universe expanding. What's the point? And, and everything's, and protons are decaying. So, there's one of your movies where you're going around saying, but protons are decaying. What's the point? And so you had this, at least you were following what was going on. And in fact, we first met when I think you were subjected to me talking about physics, I think. And Was there ever any thought or interest in science?
Yes, as a boy, I was interested in science.
But it got turned off.
Yeah.
That's what happens to so many kids.
I was interested. My parents bought me, at my urging, a microscope and
a chemistry kit, maybe?
A Lionel chemistry
of course.
set.
Yeah, those were great.
And with the cabinets that opened, and there was many chemicals in it. But I didn't have the